Hi everyone! We've considered what the benefits of trade can be in promoting growth and then development. So by trading more, a country can grow, therefore incomes might be higher, profits may be high, job creation might be very great, there may be technological transfer, there may be lower costs of production, all these major benefits to trade which can then promote development. Right. However, a country that relies on trade for growth and development can also suffer major problems. There can be limitations to this form of pursuing development. Let's consider those in this video here. Now, these trade problems are also classified as international barriers to development. Bear that in mind too, because in an exam situation it may be termed like that. So what kind of problems might a developing country have if they rely on trade for development? Well, the resource curse argument is huge. Now bear in mind what we said before, a lot of developing countries rely on the export of primary commodities for their growth, for their trade, for their development. The problem with depending on primary commodities is that there may be issues that come into the future with relying on primary commodities. Well, in the future, prices of primary commodities may well fall, and if these prices fall, export revenues are going to fall, purchasing capital imports become much more difficult, incomes in the economy are going to fall, profits of firms are going to fall. We get into a horrible vicious cycle of decline and de-development. And that's not a good thing. If a developing country is dependent on exporting primary commodities, well, there comes a stage in the future when these commodities are going to deplete. They are not an infinite resource, they are finite. So when we do run out of them, that means that a key avenue of growth and development has been restricted, has been closed. And that's not a good thing. So you could argue that depending on primary commodities is an unsustainable way of pursuing development. And also, what if in the future there is slowing demand? As I'm making this video right at the end of 2014, the price of key primary commodities is actually falling. Oil is a classic example. So a lot of countries that are oil dependent for their exports, for their growth, and for their development are suffering massively. Look at Russia, Venezuela, Nigeria. These are all countries that are really dependent on the oil price for their development, for their growth. As a result of the oil price falling hugely at the moment, they are not seeing increases in revenues at all, and therefore they are suffering in terms of pursuing key areas of development and growth. At the same time, primary commodities are very susceptible to price fluctuations. The reason is because demand and supply for primary commodities are both very inelastic indeed. Demand is very inelastic because these goods tend to be necessity goods for lots of different people and lots of different countries, and also there are very few substitutes available for these goods and services. So let's take corn as our example. Right? The demand for corn is extremely inelastic. No substitutes really a necessity good. Supply is very inelastic. Why? Because it takes a long time to produce corn. There is a huge production lag to grow it, to harvest it. At the same time, it's very hard to store corn. It can get damaged very quickly. It can go off very quickly too, making supply very inelastic. And why is that important? Is because if there are changes in market conditions in the market for corn, so if supply shifts to the right or left, if demand shifts to the right or left, there are going to be huge price swings. Let's take an example. Let's say in one summer there's been a bumper harvest of corn. There's been excellent weather and supply has increased hugely for corn. Well, that might mean that supply shifts to the right from S1 to S2. The new equilibrium gives us a lower price of P2 and a very small increase in quantity. You can see here that a relatively small shift in supply causes a huge fall in price, even though quantity has not increased by very much. Similarly, let's take the other side of the coin here, and let's say in one given summer the weather has been awful. There has been either a huge drought or maybe there has been an excess supply of rain, right? Too much rain, and that's ruined the crop. So let's take the same kind of shift of supply to the right, and what that might lead to is a much higher price of corn at P3, even though quantity has not decreased by very much at all. So at S3, where S3 means D1 new equilibrium, much higher price. The whole point we're trying to say here is that because demand and supply is so inelastic, any change in market conditions can massively affect the price, and fluctuating prices is not good for the long-run stability of a developing economy. It's going to reduce the incentive to invest. If you can't plan for the future, if the future is uncertain, investment will not take place, Export revenues are not certain as well, so therefore can you really guarantee the profitability of your firm? Can you really guarantee the stability of your whole economy if you're dependent on the revenues of these goods and services? You can't, right? So in that sense, fluctuations can be negative, very negative, and especially if prices end up falling, incomes for producers will fall, revenues generated will fall, purchasing capital imports will become more difficult. So price fluctuations are not a good thing at all, and they're often very common when countries depend on the export of primary commodities. Number 3 is a massive problem here. The access to international markets may well be limited for developing countries, and there are 3 reasons why access can be limited. The first key reason why is because developed countries may well impose protectionist measures on the export of primary commodities. So a good example of this is in the USA. The USA heavily subsidise their corn producers, their maize producers, and in doing so that lowers corn producers' cost of production in the USA, and it means for them to export is they're going to look far more competitive, they're going to look more lucrative than other countries where they don't have subsidies. So that's unfair competition, that's protectionism against developing countries who also produce corn. At the same time, that's going to have knockover effects on US poultry producers, because to feed their animals, again, is going to be cheaper. So in doing so, that's going to reduce the cost of actually producing meat, and again, it's going to make producing meat and these meat producers far more competitive. So it's unfair if advanced economies are imposing protectionist measures and are holding back the exports of developing countries in the process. That's a major issue. Another way we see this is with the EU. The EU often impose non-tariff barriers as protectionism to support its own producers, and which harms the export to developing countries. And they do this through heavy regulation and certainly imposing health and safety standards on any goods and services that are imported from developing countries. And what that does is it holds back the exports for developing countries, because either developing countries do not have the expertise to actually meet these requirements, or they don't have the technology to get to the levels of regulation standards that EU actually imposes. And that's not a good thing there. Tariff escalation is another problem that developing countries face, which destroy the incentives to move away from primary commodity dependence towards a more manufactured-based production. Tariff escalation basically implies that finished goods, manufactured goods, tend to have much higher tariffs associated with them than primary goods themselves. So the tariffs on primary commodities tend to be much lower than the tariffs on manufactured goods. In which case, what is the incentive for developing countries to produce manufactured goods if they're going to suffer from higher costs when it comes to actually exporting them? If massive tariffs are placed on manufactured goods, it's going to reduce the competitiveness aspect for developing countries to produce them. So why bother? It's going to just create more incentives to continue producing primary commodities and exporting those. Similarly, another argument is that developing countries tend to have non-convertible currencies, soft currencies that tend to fall in value, which a lot of advanced economies don't want. So again, the fact that they find it hard to convert their currencies in trade reduces the potential for trade and development too. And the final argument against trade, another problem of relying on trade for development and exporting primary commodities, is that there may well be a long-term decline in the terms of trade for developing countries, where export prices relative to import prices actually fall, and it makes it harder to sustain revenues, to sustain growth and development in the long term. And what it means is that purchasing capital imports becomes more difficult, and countries become trapped in primary commodity dependence, in falling revenues, falling growth, falling development. And my next video is going to actually isolate this problem. It's called the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis, and it's a very interesting hypothesis. So watch the next video for a detailed analysis of why this is a big problem and a barrier to trade for development. I hope that makes sense. You must know the other side of the coin, the problems of trade as well, not just thinking of trade as a massive benefit for growth and development. Hope that makes sense. Thanks for watching. See you next time.